All right, I'm going to have us settle down and move on to the second half of the morning. Dr. Leibold's going to come talk about consequences of unilateral hearing loss on hearing in natural acoustic environments where our kids live all the time.
So for this presentation, one of the things I want to try to get across is the idea that we live in a world that's really complex and contains a lot of different sources of sound. Those sounds are sometimes unpredictable. Sometimes the sounds are pretty simple noises. Other times the sounds are really complex, like language or other people talking. And one of the things that our group does generally, whether it's with children who might have hearing loss in 2 ears, children who have hearing loss in one ear, or for children with normal hearing in both ears, is that, number one, these environments are really challenging, and they're more challenging for children than they are for adults. And number two, we believe strongly in our lab that in order to understand and be able to predict the kind of challenges children with hearing loss have, we need to start incorporating measures that are getting at some of these more challenging, more natural, more complex. These are all words used to describe the same kind of general idea that we need to start moving our assessment in our clinical field towards trying to incorporate those measures in the clinic. So for this talk, again, the same terrific collaborators I had for the other talk. Actually, for the studies that I'm going to describe here, I could probably put about a dozen people up. So for a lot of the studies that we've been doing in recent years on children who have sensory neural hearing loss, our team involves expertise in audiology, in signal processing, in applied research, clinical research. And so I get to talk today, but I just want to highlight that this is really work that involves many, many people. But again, Drs. Buss and Corbin play a key role in the work that I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so a really quick overview. One of the things I want to talk about is, what listening environments do we think are the most challenging during childhood? Second, and related to this particular symposia, is what are the advantages of hearing with 2 ears versus hearing with 1 ear in these challenges? So if we know what advantages we get with hearing with 2 ears, we might be able to predict how a child with unilateral hearing loss might perform in these environments. Okay? And then third, and related to obviously the second point, is what kind of specific difficulties might we expect in natural, everyday environments that children encounter in their day-to-day lives. Okay. All right, this busy slide, really to impress the point that multiple sources of sound are common in our environment. So in the clinic, we often assess hearing. We'll do a pure tone audiogram, which assesses really simple pure tones in quiet. We do sometimes use what we call background or masking noise, and that often is pretty simple. It's a steady noise or maybe babble. But we often present sounds coming from the same location in space, so we're not necessarily getting at what's shown in this picture. So this is an illustration of a school, and you might think of, for example, a teacher here in a classroom, and for that a child in a classroom who really needs to attend to the teacher, otherwise their parents are going to find out they weren't, paying attention or following instructions in class. And we've thought for a long time about noise that's generated by these kinds of building sources. So there are actually standards by ANSI, the American Standards Institute, on what levels of noise from these kind of sources you should have in a classroom. So things like the ventilation system. Here we've got plumbing noise. There's also other sources of noise that people have considered. Things like building a school near an airport would generate obviously a lot of noise. And there's actually data to indicate that children who go to schools that are closely located near an airport have, struggle academically even when you control for other variables. So noise can impact performance. But we also get weather, rain noise, driving noise. Here we've got the music teacher upstairs. They're all standing nicely. And the one source of noise that I am going to try to highlight today, or the one source of competing background sound that I'm going to try to highlight today that we really don't consider very often is, what happens when other people are talking in the background? Okay, especially when there's just a few people talking, which is really a typical listening situation. Okay. All right, so the other point that I want to really kind of hammer in this talk is that different types of competing sounds interfere with speech understanding either more than others or differently than others. And just to make it even more complex is they seem to affect children and adults in different ways, depending on how old they are. And so it becomes a bit of a puzzle to try to solve what's going on. So here's just an example of a noise waveform. And I don't want to go into the details of frequency, time, intensity, but what I wanted to show you is that you can see that this is a fairly simple waveform. It consists of energy across a wide range. There's not a lot of, this actually shows performance across time. You can see there's not really gaps in time. The noise is just shh, it's on all the time. Okay, and this is by far the most common source of noise we use in clinical assessment if we're measuring performance. Here we have an example of just a really short sentence, and you can see the waveform is varying. There seems to be gaps in time. If I plotted this in frequency, we'd have a lot of dynamic changes going on. And so it turns out that these factors are pretty critically important. And so a lot of what I do, which I promise I'm not going to really talk about today, is I focus a lot on the nitty-gritty of manipulating these sounds and trying to understand what factors are really important. I'm not going to talk about that much today, but what I'm going to try to talk about is just a broad overview of some of the things we've learned from our studies involving children as they age, as well as children who have hearing loss. Okay. All right, so this is the hardest slide of the whole talk, and I promise you the whole talk is not going to be like this, but it's a really key point, and it's something that if you're an audiologist, you probably started hearing about at conferences, but it's really a phenomenon we've been talking about for in the research world for probably 25 years, and that is that different types of background sounds produce different types of interference. So if we ask a child to understand speech, the competing background sound interferes with your ability to understand speech, to recognize, to identify it, but it does so in different ways depending on some of the characteristics of the background. So, and one of the things we talk about, and I'll probably switch back and forth a little bit, but we often talk about these background sounds as maskers, and that just is saying that it covers up or masks your ability to hear speech. It's got a historical term. So background, interference, competition, masker, all the same things, if you hear this. Okay, so in this first example, this is often what we think of when we think about noise or background sounds. So we have an example here where we have a teacher in a class, in a small, probably preschool classroom. One of the things to highlight that I forgot to mention in my earlier talk too is, unlike, older school age classrooms, these children are often at different elevations. So sometimes they're in seats, sometimes they're on the ground, sometimes the teacher's here, sometimes the teacher's there. So we have a lot of complexity just in terms of location. And it's not atypical to have ventilation noise. And there are ANSI specifications for these ventilation noise sources that I think are pretty lenient. And in fact, most schools don't meet them. So most schools are noisier than they should be based on standards that I would say are pretty lenient. So this is a pretty common source of noise. And what it does, this type of noise, it's a steady background. It has energy at a lot of frequencies. It tends to overlap directly with the target speech at a sensory level. So for those of you who really care, it produces waves of overlap on the basilar membrane. So it really reduces how audible the speech is. It covers it up. So what information gets encoded by the peripheral auditory system and sent to the brain is degraded. Okay, and this is shown here visually. So we have produces a steady noise. It's shown here visually by these blacked out bars. So this is the information that remains that the brain has to use to decode the sound. Okay? And we call this in our field energetic masking. I don't know that I use that throughout the talk, but it's really a peripheral encoding problem. Okay? And we think about this noise a lot in the clinic. We know that noise degrades performance, but what we're really talking about is overlap in the peripheral auditory system, in the cochlea. We know also that if the cochlea is damaged or if a child has a sensory neural hearing loss that involves damage to the cochlea, that this process gets interfered with even to a greater extent. So you get this distortion even when you amplify speech sometimes. Okay? What I'm going to talk about a lot today is a different kind of masking that we talk about a lot in the literature. Everything you read now is informational masking, all the conferences that I've been going to. But it's a phenomenon we've known a lot about for a long time, but I think is becoming more and more important when we think about clinical assessment and everyday listening performance. And in this case, we have a different kind of masker. We have speech. So here's this wave from before. And in a preschool classroom, what I've showed you here is the teacher reading a story to a small group of children. But like many preschools, in the corner, we have another teacher who's pulled one child aside and they're reading. And this is very common in preschool classrooms. Even in young school-age classrooms, you have small groups that are working, and they produce speech. And what we see for these types of interference is a little bit different. So in this case, you do have some overlap. It's hard, you've degraded the target a bit, but the real problem here is actually something we call informational masking. And the real problem, as it turns out, is that it's really hard to do two things. One is it's really hard to separate, okay, what belongs to the target? Who's talking here? And what aspects belong to the background or the masker? So if you're listening to me and somebody's in the back talking, it may be really hard to separate my voice and the acoustic features that belong to my voice from other people talking. And the other thing is, even once you are able to segregate or separate, it may be really hard to stay focused on my voice. It may be hard to selectively attend because the other speech is just so interfering. Speech by definition is really meaningful and interesting to us. And for a developing child, it turns out that process, both of those processes, but especially the ability to selectively attend to one person talking and ignore another person talking, really, really hard. Okay? And most of you who have or have ever seen a child would buy that that's true. Okay. The other issue is that this is not a peripheral problem. This is a central problem. This is really due to higher order processes. So a lot of my work is focused on what processes those are, and we think of perception in terms of sound segregation, a selective attention. My colleague at Boys Town, Ryan McCreary, who's the director of their audiology program, he and I get in arguments all the time because he would argue that these are cognitive processes like executive function and short-term memory and working memory. And I think we're actually talking about the same things. It's just that whether it's specific to the auditory system or just something more general. So there's a lot of interest in this area from clinical folks, from psychologists, about what exactly is going on. But we know that this isn't mostly driven by an inability to separate these things at a real peripheral level. The brain gets good information, basically. It's just it's not using that information in an optimal way. Okay. All right, so here's an example. This, I think, is pretty easy for most of you. What I've shown you is an example of what we might do in the lab to kind of try to tease these apart. The first clip I'm going to play for you is a noise background, and you'll hear a word embedded in it. And we do this with children all the time, and this is pretty easy for most children with normal hearing.
Ice cream.
Pretty straightforward. And so the next clip I'm going to play is the same thing with two competing streams of speech. So for this example, I think we have people reading from familiar children's books. We have a bunch of these different maskers, backgrounds that we play with. And we'll let you see, I've kind of primed you. It's the same target word. But just see whether you think it's easier, harder, or the same.
Now I will go and find my mother.
Ice cream.
Are you my mother? The baby
So
bird asked.
if you heard that, just know that most
Just
children,
look.
even 10-year-olds, can't do that at that signal-to-noise ratio level. It's just really challenging. It's challenging for adults. But what I will say is we know that the amount of energy that's actually overlapping in the basilar membrane is far less with that speech. You can tell if you look at it, there's all these gaps. It just doesn't have as much energy. It shouldn't be as big of a problem if all you're thinking about is the cochlea. But it turns out that it's really hard. It's hard for adults, and it's particularly hard for young listeners, okay? And so a lot of my work is focused on, and so we say that this kind of masker produces a lot of energetic masking, so peripheral, and this one produces a lot of informational masking or kind of confusability effects, okay? All right, so just to summarize some of the work that's been done with children who have normal hearing sensitivity, we'll talk about them first. We know from many, many studies that children just have more difficulty understanding speech in noise. So just that simple noise, children have more difficulty than adults. But that by the age of 10, by most accounts, this ability looks adult-like. So if you test a 5-year-old in a shh background, they tend to perform worse than adults. They need a higher signal. They need the signal to be higher than the noise by a greater amount than an adult. But by about 10 years of age, most kids are performing at an adult-like level. Okay? And there's actually a lot of studies that have looked at this. And in the clinic, when you use masking noise, this is essentially the same paradigm. And it's based on some of the developmental studies. What we do know as well is that these difficulties are larger when the background's competing speech. So it isn't just that everybody finds it difficult. It's proportionally worse for a young listener. And the effects, as I'll show you in a minute, are hit you over the head. They're really, really poor at these situations. And also it takes longer to mature. So Nicole recently published a study in Ear and Hearing that mapped out the trajectory. So it involved testing a lot of children, like 50, 60 children, across the age range of 5 to 16, I believe. And really showed this really clear developmental trajectory difference. And in my lab, when I first started working with school-aged children, so I did my PhD here working with infants, and then I went to Boys Town and I worked with school-aged children. I used to stop at 10 thinking, well, that should capture the age effect. And then I realized, well, they were still quite a lot worse than adults. So then we started testing to age 13. Now in my lab, I test all the way up till 17. You know, we had a panic when we were doing Nicole's study that maybe an 18-year-old isn't mature, and yet that's what our control adult group is. But we're confident that by 18, they look mature. It's sometime after age 13 that we see some pretty dramatic, but it's a really prolonged process. The ability to operate in these environments takes many, many years of neural maturation and experience with sound to master. Okay? And here's just a quick example from my lab that I think will be pretty accessible. We've done a number of studies, as have others, lots of different speech in background, competing background studies. We all get the same result, no matter what materials we use and tasks we use. So this is a really convincing finding across many labs. So in this particular study, this is a study that I did with my colleague Emily Buss, and we looked at consonant identification. So real basic, can you tell what this consonant is? So we had children between the ages of 5 and 13 years. They all had normal hearing, and we also tested adults as controls. And the task was they had, similar to an iPad, they had a touchscreen monitor, they sat in a booth, they wore headphones. They heard a background sound, which was either that shh noise or the two-talker speech that I'd showed you before. And they heard one of these consonants, and they just had to click on the touchscreen, touch it, indicate what they heard, or say, I don't know. Okay. And here are the results. These are the main results. What is shown on this plot is something called percent correct identification. So if we played 100 consonants and they got 80 of them right, they'd have 80% correct. Okay. And so up on in this case, up is better. And here I'm showing performance for the noise, so the shh noise background. And we showed as a function of age. So we looked at 5 to 7-year-olds, 8 to 10-year-olds, 11 to 13-year-olds, and adults. And what you can see kind of clearly here is the youngest children, as other people have observed many times before us, they did poor on this task at the same level of noise. They detected 80% of the consonants, whereas adults, you can see here, are at 90%. And we don't let adults get 100%. We make it so that the noise, we play around in the lab a lot to find the level which adults can get about 90% correct, and then we fix it and we test everybody at that level. So here you can see that the 5 to 7-year-olds are pretty robust effect, and even the 8 to 10-year-olds, if you look at these open bars compared to adults, this is the difference here. There may be a little bit worse, but they're getting there, and certainly by 11 to 13-year-olds are performing as well as the adults. Okay, so that replicates the other studies. But what's shown here by the filled bars is performance on the same task, but with this two-talker competition. And what you can see here really dramatically is that there's big age effects. 5 to 7-year-olds, instead of recognizing 80% of the consonants, they can only get about 50%. But the other thing that's really kind of hit you over the head, and dramatic and surprising in some ways, is even these 11 to 13-year-olds are not adult-like, and other people have observed this. And so even in the early teenage years, this is a substantial problem. Okay? I'm not going to show any plots on this, but we did do an error analysis. So one of the things that's really neat about this task is if you do a consonant task, you can actually figure out, well, what errors? So if the consonant was an M, did they say N? Did they say which is very closely related to an M, we would say that that's just a small feature error, versus did they say SH, which might be unrelated altogether. And what we find for kids and adults is that in the noise masker, when they make mistakes, it's based on what we think it's really based on audibility. They're not hearing part of the speech, so they'll say something that's closely related. So M and N is a really common substitution because the noise just masks that portion that would allow you to tell you whether it was an M or an N, but they tend to be closely related errors. That's also true for adults in the two-talker background to a lesser extent, but for the children, the errors they make in this two-talker background, they're not even related to the target. And what that's telling us is that it's not audibility, it's not, they're making confusions. And had we thought about it at the time, we maybe would have recorded what was in the background, but we think a good possibility is that they were actually saying what they heard in the background instead of the target, so they were confusing them. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so just to summarize, all this research, what we know about the ability to perceive speech when other speech is present, and usually when we're talking about complex speech backgrounds, we're not talking about babble, which often has 8, 10. That actually acts a lot like noise. You can't make out the individual speech streams. What I'm talking about is when you have a small number of speech competitors, usually 2 or 3 tends to be, even 1 for a child tends to be pretty confusing. And what we know is age matters, that younger children have considerably more difficulty than older children who have considerably more difficulty than adults. Okay? The background matters, and it matters a lot. So we see these big prolonged developmental effects when the background's this complex speech masker than when it's a noise masker. Okay, so why does this matter? I mean, why does this matter clinically? Well, a couple of reasons. One is that we think speech understanding in the presence of competing speech is probably a better estimate of what is actually going on in the real life than speech in these steady noise maskers. And there are data from several labs that have tried to kind of capture the proportion of time a child spends in a noisy environment, and then recently going further and saying, well, what kind of environments are they? And it turns out that even in the early school age years, more than half the time a child's away from the house, they're hearing competing speech. And it's actually pretty close to half the time in the house if you consider things like the TV playing a stream of speech. So these are things that children are exposed to all the time that we really aren't capturing, but we know are really difficult. Okay. And this is the one I think is pretty compelling and sort of sobering, is we're probably underestimating. So we know that children with hearing loss really struggle in noisy environments, but we are probably actually underestimating how much they struggle because we don't assess them in these conditions that we know are more difficult. Okay, and so that's really interesting, is we think that we have a good handle and we already recognize that it's a problem, but it's probably for some children even more of a challenge than we've thought. Okay, and so shifting gears now to think about what this might mean for a child with unilateral hearing loss. The big kind of punchline is we don't really know the answer. Dr. Corbin is going to talk about her recent work, which I think is motivated very much by this question, and I think is really encouraging. But we really don't know a lot. We actually don't know a lot with children who have bilateral sensory neural hearing loss either. But we're starting to, and I think that that's really encouraging. Okay, so we talked about sort of basic binaural cues and monaural cues that you might use to localize a sound in space in my first talk. Now I'm going to talk about, well, what does binaural hearing mean in these kind of complex environments where you have speech, you have noise, you have all these different things going on. And localization is clearly one of those benefits, which we talked about in the earlier slides. Echo suppression, which is pretty cool and interesting, and I'll talk about that first in the next slides. So when you have 2 ears, it turns out that you're better able to hear in reverberant environments. And a reverberant environment just means there's a lot of echoes, just a word that we use. And it turns out 2 ears are very helpful for listening in those conditions. Speech understanding and noise, and not in this context, we use the term noise usually to mean any unwanted sound. We're trying in our lab to kind of split that apart to talk about kind of steady noise and complex speech. But it turns out that 2 ears can help you a lot in these situations. Source segregation. This is a confusing term, but really what it means is if there is a target talker and other people talking, what can you use to determine what features of the incoming waveform belong to the target? Because that's what you want to pay attention to. You don't want to pay attention to the noise, but you need to be able to figure out somehow which came with which. And a really powerful cue for doing that is that different sounds often originate from different points in space. So once you determine that, you can say, okay, well, that came from there. That belongs to the background. Dr. Norton's talking, and she's here, and I have these cues. I'm going to associate everything with binaural cues to her. And so that has gained a lot of traction in more adult psychophysical work, but I think is really starting to receive a lot of attention in the pediatric and applied pediatric literature. And finally, listening effort, which I think is a really interesting phenomenon. We don't do this work in my lab, so I'm only going to mention it at the end. But there is emerging data that would indicate that it just takes more effort to listen when you have one ear versus two, that you get redundancy when you have two ears that are receiving input and sending that information to the brain. It's less effortful. You're not as tired. Listening fatigue is another term that comes to mind. And there are some studies that are really trying to get at what that might mean and what consequences that might have. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about echo suppression first. Really, the idea is that an environment, most natural environments, including this one, contains direct sounds. So when you're listening to me, you are getting a direct sound, but you're also receiving, whether you're perceiving it or not, reflections from all the surfaces in the room. And some rooms are clearly more reverberant than others. And it turns out, not surprisingly, that this is pretty challenging. And we also don't really assess this at all in the clinic, at least that I'm aware of. There are labs that look at this, but we don't. It's a technically challenging environment to set up. We care about it in classrooms. We want to have our classrooms below a certain reverberation level. But aside from that, the study of this in children, especially children with hearing loss, is really in its infancy. But we know that these are pretty challenging environments. So one of the things we typically think of when we think of echo suppression is something called the precedence effect, which is essentially echo suppression. And what that means is that for listeners with normal hearing in both ears, when you receive sounds that are reflecting off surfaces, it's usually, as long as the reflections occur pretty briefly after the first waveform, that they get suppressed by the auditory system. The auditory system gives preference to the first sound it receives. And I'm going to show you just a quick schematic. Here we have just a generic head, and we have sounds that are played from the right speaker and then from the left speaker. And what we do is we put a lag. So these ones arrive a little bit later. And what happens in this case is that listeners only perceive the first sound. They suppress the second one, as long as it's not more intense than the first one, because that's what an echo is. It's a reflection that tends to be less intense. So in this environment, there may well be really brief echoes your auditory system is receiving, but they're suppressed. Okay, and that helps you listen in a reverberant environment, because if you heard all the echoes, it would make it really difficult. Okay, and people have played these kind of games in the lab where they actually just do the same thing and they make the delay longer. And what happens in the case where the delay is kind of longer, and you would know this if you're in a tunnel, which tends to have a really long lag, is that you perceive two sounds. You perceive the one that arrived at your first, and then you perceive the second one after. And so when you hear echoes, essentially, usually the issue, it's kind of simplifying it a bit, but often the issue is that the time between the first and the second waveform was really long, and so your system doesn't suppress those, because that's not as typical as really brief echoes. Make sense? Okay. All right. So I love this example because I think it illustrates this effect really well. What you're going to hear is a brick being struck in a reverberant room. And so I'm just going to play that. And what I think you'll hear, I'm kind of priming you again, but I think what you'll hear is a relatively brief striking sound. So let's see. So you hear a brick being struck in a room. Okay, I'm going to play the same sound. I haven't done anything to it other than reversed it in time. And I think what you'll hear now is the echo, because it's coming first. You don't suppress it. And so it's going to sound really long, I think. Isn't that cool? It's like a cool demo. And so it's the same sound. It's just been time reversed, but your system doesn't suppress that initial reverberation when it occurs first. And so it's a good thing it didn't. You don't want to hear the brick followed by a trail of echoes. And if it's speech, you might imagine what that would sound like. Okay? All right. So what do we know about the precedence effect? Not a whole lot. But we do know that it's not present early in infancy, which would suggest that either there's neural circuitry that needs to develop or maybe experience-driven. But it does seem to emerge by 4 to 5 months of age. So people who have studied this in infancy don't see any evidence that it exists shortly after birth, but they have observed at least rudimentary precedence effects, a rudimentary precedence effect in infants by 6 months of age. Okay. However, they seem to have more difficulty. Ruth Latosky from the University of Wisconsin in Madison has done a lot of work in this area and has basically found that they're just not as good as adults at suppressing echoes. And there's other work by a woman named Arlene Newman and her colleagues in New York City. And what she has shown is sort of the consequence of not being mature in your ability to suppress echoes is that when you test children in reverberation, so if you play a background sound and you add or manipulate reverberation, children kind of fall apart more than adults do in that environment. So reverberation essentially degrades speech understanding for everybody, but it hurts kids more than adults. Okay? All right. So what if you have unilateral hearing loss? Really, it's a binaural phenomenon. If you have if you have single-sided deafness, for example, you don't have access to this phenomenon. And so it's really unclear, is there another mechanism by which we can suppress echoes? We don't think so. And we really haven't studied effects of unilateral hearing loss for children in reverberant environments, but my prediction is that they would really they would struggle considerably more than their peers with normal hearing loss. And so when you're thinking about classroom design, well, it's not just Seattle. I think this is the modern, I was going to say I love Seattle architecture, like love it. And we did this in North Carolina too. But the idea of building a all concrete bamboo school, which is actually not uncommon, sounds great. But in North Carolina, I know they built their new high school. It was all these beautiful sustainable materials, just gorgeous high ceilings. They actually had to have somebody come in and try to add soundproofing after the fact because it was so reverberant. And so these sound, there are some minor modifications you can make to adjust the environment, but these highly reverberant environments are really challenging for children with unilateral hearing loss, I would predict. Okay. A little bit of information. So there's a number of reasons why they may be challenging, but one of the things we know is that the vowel sounds are really high in intensity. So if a vowel sound, if you don't suppress the echo of a vowel sound, it may in fact come in close to the same intensity as a lower volume, lower intensity consonant sound. So you can have a situation where some sounds will mask others, and the net effect is just degraded speech. Does that make sense? So not all speech sounds are the same, and you can just basically have the situation where one speech that arrives sooner, if the echo is not suppressed, can mask another speech sound. Okay. This is sort of a hard slide to illustrate. So I'm going to try to be nice and slow. This is an example of speech understanding and noise for children with unilateral hearing loss. It's a fairly well-known study conducted by Fred Bess and his colleagues at Vanderbilt. And this was done almost 30 years ago. And we really we have additional data, but not as much as you might think since this early study. What's shown here is, again, percent correct. So they measured the proportion of words that a child got correct in different listening situations. So higher is better. 80% correct is better than, say, 20% correct. Okay, and they measured 3 groups of listeners and 3 groups of kind of listening, or they measured 2 groups of listeners, but for the children with unilateral hearing loss, they looked at performance in 2 different ways. So the first group that they looked at were children with normal hearing in both ears, and that's shown here by the dark gray bars. And what they have is a situation where they're having target speech from one side and a masker, which was steady noise, to the other side. Okay? And so that's this situation. So anytime you see these filled bars, that's the listeners with normal hearing. Okay? Then they looked at children with unilateral hearing loss, and they looked at 2 conditions. In one case, they had the target speech go to the ear with normal hearing, and then the noise or the competing background went to the ear with unilateral hearing loss. And that's shown by the open bars here. And then, of course, the third situation was a reverse. They put the target speech to the good ear with normal hearing, and then the masker speech, reverse. The the target speech went to the ear with hearing loss. And then that's why I did the heads. I had this in words, and everyone is like, ah. So the masking noise actually went to the good ear, okay? So you can see that this would have an implication for just where to seat a child in a classroom. And the first thing they found, which is just such an interesting effect here, is that even in quiet, children with unilateral hearing loss performed more poorly than their counterparts with normal hearing. It's not a large effect, but it has been observed by other labs. And so even when you have things directly coming in front of you, where presumably there'd be no spatial advantage, that even under those situations, that children with unilateral hearing loss perform more poorly than their counterparts. And this is one of the reasons why people have wondered about factors like listening effort. So maybe it's just harder for children to understand speech in these environments. But it's a relatively small effect, as you can see here. Okay, the one thing that we've plotted here on the x-axis is something called signal-to-noise ratio. And basically, a larger number means more favorable. So a signal-to-noise ratio would mean the target speech of 10 would mean that the target speech was 10 dB higher than the competing noise. Okay, so that's a better signal-to-noise ratio than you see in almost any classroom. Well, it's a better signal-to-noise ratio than you see in a lot of classrooms. So it's pretty favorable. So, but it means that the signal's 10 dB higher than the noise. And a signal-to-noise ratio of 0 means that the noise and the target are the same intensity. So it's harder, okay? And what you can see first for this example with the more favorable is that children with unilateral hearing loss and children with normal hearing perform almost the same if you set it up so that the target speech is going to the good ear. And that makes sense in a way because the noise is going to the ear that doesn't hear well and shouldn't interfere. So if the target speech is directed at the ear with normal hearing, there's not a big hit. However, you can see that once you present the target speech to the poor ear and the background to the normal hearing ear, that there's a big decrement in performance, okay? And the other thing you can see is that this effect gets magnified when it becomes a more difficult listening situation. So when you make the noise less advantageous, when you make the noise level greater relative to the signal, children fall apart even more. And these data were actually pretty instrumental in efforts to advocate for things like FM systems in the classroom for children with unilateral hearing loss. And these data tend to hold. These are data that have been observed by other researchers, although there hasn't been a lot of data collected in this area. There has been more, as Dr. Liu said, in the last 5 years, really. There were a lot of really good early studies, and then there's been a bit of a gap in studies. Okay, so why? Why are these hard environments for children with unilateral hearing loss? Well, having only one ear makes it difficult to extract speech from noise, in part because all these cues that I talked about before, you're not going to have access to, or you're going to have reduced access to if you have hearing loss in one ear, okay? The other thing, and this is sort of a confusing idea to get around, but I think is really critical, is these cues that we talked about, these time differences, these intensity differences, in complex environments when you have more than one source of sound going at the same time, they actually work together to help you determine what is the target and what's the background, and to split those out. And if you have two normally hearing ears and you can do that task, your speech understanding improves dramatically. When you have one ear which has hearing loss, it becomes pretty challenging under some situations. I'm going to go through these, especially the last one, are a little bit tricky, but I think it will set up what Dr. Corbin's going to talk about after lunch, which is really clinically motivated, and also to let you know what we're thinking of moving forward. So binaural summation really refers to the fact that two ears with normal hearing provide some redundancy. So in this setup, the way that people often measure summation is you might present the signal, and if you look closely, there's a background from the same speaker in space. And if you have two, well, is that a message? All right. If you have two ears, essentially the problem is easier than if you have one ear. So here I'm going to show kind of an illustration of if you have one ear with unilateral hearing loss. it just becomes a harder problem. And it's a relatively small effect for most listeners, usually on the order of a couple dB. But really, if you're trying to understand speech and noise, a couple dB can be a lot. But it tends to be a relatively small effect. So even with listeners who have normal hearing in both ears, if you plug up one ear, generally their speech understanding and noise becomes affected. Okay. All right, the next one, head shadow effect. So I talked about how the head forms sort of an acoustic shadow. So if sounds are coming to my right, essentially what happens is the signal to noise ratio on the opposite ear is less than the ear that it hits first. And this is a really powerful cue for speech understanding in environments where things are coming from different locations in space. And so the example I've shown here is you have a target talker from here, and then you have the teacher and the child from the other side, and versus a situation where you have hearing loss in one ear. And it turns out that the advantage you get from having two ears under this situation is really robust. So in steady noise, it can be, affect 6, 7, even sometimes more decibels, which is a really robust advantage. And as Nicole's going to talk about in her talk later, we know that in competing speech backgrounds, these highly complex backgrounds where that segregation issue is so critical, the effects are substantially higher. So the importance of having access to that information in complex environments, we think, is dramatically higher than it is when it's a steady background. And in part because you can already, trying to think of the way to explain this. One of the things we talk about is really things that sound really similar are harder to separate. I mean, I think that's the basic phenomenon. You can make all kinds of terms associated with it, but a noise for most listeners doesn't sound a lot like speech, but other people talking obviously sounds a lot like speech. And so having the access to, or having the ability to partition them into space is going to have a much bigger effect when it's these complex environments. And Nicole's, I think, data are going to show that really clearly. The other phenomenon is a really tricky one called binaural squelch, and essentially it refers to a real cognitive process where the brain compares information it gets across two ears, and it can use that information, again, to separate one sound from another. So by having hearing in one ear, and we understand very little about this effect, it tends to also be pretty small for things like a steady noise masker, but under conditions where the background's complex, we think it's actually quite a bit larger. And one of the things that's really interesting in Nicole's data, that I don't know that it's a focus of what she's going to talk about, but one of the things that we found that was really interesting is that when the background's competing speech, I think I showed the slide that indicated if you put the masker to the good ear and the target speech to the bad ear, that almost always hurts you when you have unilateral hearing loss if it's steady noise. It turns out if it's two-talker speech, it actually helps you by a fair amount. And we think the reason for that is that the brain is able to use that information about the masker to say, oh, I'm supposed to ignore that. At least I know what I'm not supposed to pay attention to. And it's a really cognitive function that we don't understand a lot about. But I think that it's exciting to think about those options because I think it gives us some real promise of how we might affect change in a more natural environment.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. And there's a reason why, squelch is a tough phenomenon. So when a background steady noise, if you have unilateral hearing loss and you present the masker, the background you don't want to pay attention to the good ear, and the target to the ear with unilateral hearing loss, it tends to make your performance worse, right? And it's certainly much worse than what you would see if you flipped it and you had the speech going to the good ear. There's almost an advantage to playing the masker to the bad ear because you're not going to hear it, and so it can't interfere with your perception. When the background's this two-talker speech, though, it looks like for both children and adults that can confer an advantage. And it's almost like knowing what the masker's about might help you actually say, oh, I don't want to pay attention to that. That's not relevant, but you have that information. It's like the brain gets that information and can somehow almost exclude it, we think. And so we have some thoughts on expanding that work, but the early results were pretty surprising because squelch is usually a pretty small psychophysical phenomenon, but in this two-talker masker we found a pretty robust effect that we weren't necessarily thinking we'd see. And so some things basically to indicate that it's a really complex problem that we need to think about more. Nicole is going to talk about our work in complex environments in children with bilateral sensory neural hearing loss, which I think forms a lot of the motivation for our work, and I'm not going to hit on that now. But I am going to end with saying that even in many children with unilateral hearing loss struggle relative to their peers with normal hearing, even without spatial cues, which I think is a really interesting phenomenon and may just suggest these things that we don't tend to tap into in either the lab or the clinic, that it can be very tiring. I mean, it can be, we know just from talking to our patients, at least, it wasn't uncommon when I worked clinically to hear patients say how fatigued they were at the end of the day. And yet we haven't as a field got a great measure yet to capture that, but people are really working on that because I think it captures a really interesting dimension. You might be able to come into a lab and understand speech really well and noise, but if you had to do that for 8 hours, what would you do? Would you just get tired and stop trying? Would you just come home really fatigued? And so people are really interested in these measures of fatigue or effort, and it seems like it's an area of really interesting research for children with unilateral hearing loss as well. Okay, so just some general implications is one of the things we know, and that again Nicole is going to talk about more in her study, is that listening with 2 ears provides a big advantage when there's competing sounds present, because you're able to use that information to determine which waveforms reaching your ear belong to which source and which location in space. What we also know is that the magnitude of that effect or the benefit you get is substantially greater when it's a complex background. So again, if we knew more about hearing in complex backgrounds and how these effects mature, I think we'd be in a really nice position to address some of those difficulties that children are having with unilateral hearing loss. We know very little about how children with unilateral hearing loss though perform in those environments just broadly, let alone with spatial separation. And but again, I think that we're moving in that direction. Okay, that's what I've got. Thanks. Is that Sue Turner?
Laurie, how are you?
I'm good, fellow Canadian.
Oh, nice to see you. I have so many questions, and I don't know if this is going to be relevant to you now or if it'll be addressed later. So,
yeah.
Question number 1. So there's a developmental effect then to being able to suppress noise for kids, yes?
Yes.
When we identify early hearing loss in children, we're always really anxious to provide an improved signal-to-noise ratio and introduce FM. Are we denying them the ability to naturally do the suppression?
Great question, and one that is the only one I actually prepared for, because I get asked that all the time. So, and basically my answer is really not that compelling. The answer is we don't know, but we do know that children with hearing loss struggle to understand speech in their environments. We do know that classrooms have often pretty poor signal-to-noise ratios, and we do know that if we can't get a message to a child, they're not going to learn speech and language. So until we know more about the effects of experience on this, I would absolutely encourage folks to do whatever they can to improve the signal-to-noise ratio. I do think it gets at really interesting questions, though, about do you turn on the environmental microphone or not? Do you provide extra training? So I think the idea you're getting at is, do you need to listen in noise to become good at listening in noise? And I think the answer is probably yes.
Yes.
But we also are dealing with children who are at risk for speech and language delays, and so I think it's a question we've been asked now for probably 6 or 7 years, and we still don't know. And I think we could address those questions, but whether there's a need for training, I think
that's question number 2.
Yeah, and we do know there's a lot of peripheral data that our lab and others have collected. So we do know that children who are raised in Spanish-speaking homes, for example, so if you have the competing background, if you do the same kind of game, for those of us who do not speak Spanish, so I don't speak Spanish, if the competing background is Spanish, I'll do better than if the competing background's English. And that's clearly an experience-driven effect. But if you test Spanish-speaking listeners, they show the reverse effect. So clearly what you hear influences your ability to hear in noise. And I think those are really critical questions. And I think the issue of turning the environmental microphone on or not is pretty key.
And the training question for me is, so of course, we're going to fit FM as early as we need to and all of that stuff. And what I'm wondering about is for kids who are being provided auditory training, you know, we consider listening noise a really high-level skill. If a kid is doing very well on phonetic ability and recognizing words and da-da-da-da-da, a lot of times we go, well, they're all okay. But should we be looking a little bit more deeply and saying we need to do listening and noise training, whether or not the teacher is noting a difficult situation in the classroom? Because often we'll wait until, oh, this child is having difficulty. But it feels to me like maybe we can, and can that be trained?
All great questions. So one of the things Nicole is going to touch on is, you know, sort of a really important question is, so we showed you that children perform really poor in competing speech compared to steady noise. But, you know, a really fundamental question is, well, does that actually tell us something that's clinically useful? And it turns out that we did a follow-up study that Nicole will talk about, where performance in a two-talker masker predicts parents' parents' reports of their children's everyday communication abilities. Performance in a steady noise masker doesn't. And so that, I think, is really exciting that we might be able to leverage and access that. Related to the question, though, of the training and what kind of training, I think that one of the issues is in the classroom, for example, how we're assessing or how we're providing training. Maybe it's often in a steady noise or a babble, and maybe there's other sophisticated ways that you can tease that apart. It's also true, one of the things I didn't talk about, which is really encouraging in my view, is so children are performing really poorly in these environments, but you can manipulate the acoustics of the signal to make something more perceptually dissimilar, which you can't do for a sensory problem. You know, we don't have a way right now to fix the encoding on the auditory system, but if it's a cognitive process, so I can't tell what a target is and a signal is, we have some really cool kind of parlor tricks where we can actually affect that. We can shift the frequency. We know that if you have a mismatch in the sex of the target and the masker, so if the masker is a male and the target's a female, you do a lot better. And we have a lot of ways that we think we can affect, improve things, which is really encouraging in that regard. And so, but I don't think we're doing a lot in terms of training, but I think that you've hit all the key questions of what we need to do.
Just one last thing. So I'm thinking too, with kids who are bilateral hearing loss, symmetrical hearing loss, we know that they have difficulty in noise. And for some of the kids that I work with, when they are in most environments doing extremely well, and all I've got left to work on is listening and noise, I will still see that they struggle, and we can train using all kinds of different materials. But now I'm thinking, what about a 5-year-old, 6-year-old unilateral hearing loss kiddo who we know is having difficulty in noise, but we don't do a lot in terms of addressing, we amplify in the classroom, but do they need training and practice?
Well, and I think I'd argue that, you know, data like Dr. Liu and Dr. Corbin are going to present are indicating perhaps the answer is yes. So one of the issues has been that we don't have a really good way to assess which children are going to have difficulty and which aren't, for children with unilateral loss. And then once we get to that point, what do we do? But I think that with all the, there's a lot of interest in this area from a lot of different angles, and I'm pretty confident we're moving at least systematically and rigorously towards addressing some of these questions. But yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but.
Hi, I'm a parent of a 5.5-year-old with one-sided hearing loss that changes with his tumor. I was curious about the SQUELCH that you talked about, and most importantly about if, as you're training to focus on the teacher's voice or whatever, does the two-talker background noise, so, you know, I've been in his classroom as kids are talking, does it change as the two-talker noise changes? So he hears 2 kids talking over here, and then 2 kids over here at the mass station, and then 2 kids. Is each of that a time where he has to listen in, factor it out, listen in over there? Does each of those affect it?
So probably. We're not there yet, you know, in terms of the lab. So one of my colleagues at Boys Town, Donna Lewis, is really interested in the idea that the background is changing where it's coming from too. So she's doing these kind of cool studies where she manipulates where the masker's coming from versus when it's steady. So there you have a situation that's sort of what we call acoustically uncertain, which we do know is more difficult. And I'm always amazed, the teachers in the classroom who have a lot of things to deal with, even when they have children that they know have hearing loss, they're still more likely, to rate that the children have difficulties attending, focusing, all those things. And yet I suspect a lot of these factors are auditory. And we do have data on children with bilateral hearing loss in these complex backgrounds. And they're poorer, of course, in steady noise, but the hit they take when it's these complex backgrounds, which are clear cognitive, experience-driven effects, is pretty substantial. It's hard for all children. It's harder still for children with hearing loss. We don't know a lot of information about children with unilateral hearing loss, but I think your observations are spot on. I think that would be a really difficult listening situation for any child, let alone a child with hearing loss. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Who do you want to point to somebody?
Oh, I think there was a right in the front there. Yeah, but yes.
A really simple question, but I just wanted to understand, when we talk about unilateral hearing loss, are we talking about kids with any degree of hearing loss, so mild to profound?
Yes. So our lab tends to focus on children with kind of more mild to moderate hearing loss, but a lot of the research has been done in the last several years has focused on what people would refer to as single-sided deafness, which is essentially no hearing or very little hearing. And those groups are likely to differ in how they perform. It's actually, having asymmetric input is a really tricky problem. So for a child who might have normal hearing in one ear and say a moderate hearing loss in the other ear, there's just so many questions clinically, but from animal work we know that providing asymmetric input has direct consequences on the development of the cortical auditory system. And so, and the other question that we're always faced with is, how much of a hearing loss do you need to have in order for it to be effectively single-sided deafness? And all questions that haven't, there's really so few people who study this area that I don't know the answer to that question. I'm looking at Dr. Liu, and she would be the person I'd probably call if I wanted to know. So, yeah. So most of the studies, so Nicole has this real interest in children who you might be able to apply amplification, acoustic hearing aid. And in some ways that seems like that would provide symmetric input. When you talk about children with cochlear implants, it's a whole different set. And yeah, so that adds to the complexity. And I really haven't focused at all on children with conductive loss or fluctuating, which would be sometimes they have an ear infection, or fluid in their ear, sometimes they don't. And how does that sort of inconsistent input affect development? If what you're trying to do is learn this map of space, but sometimes you have normal hearing, other times you have a low frequency hearing loss, like what? Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know the answer.
I
keep saying that I don't know the answer, but I think that's...
So what you presented today, your research was related to mild to moderate, or...
Probably more, well, no, to date, the research that we've done in my lab has mostly been on children with bilateral hearing loss, and Nicole is presenting data where we simulate a hearing loss by plugging up an ear. Oh. But most of the research that's been done in the field, there's been very little on complex listening situations, almost maybe nothing, maybe one study, have looked at single-sided deafness. And so I think we're still in the early stages of mapping that out, but we can make predictions based on what we know, that these are hard conditions for children with hearing loss, and we know that if you don't have access to these cues, you're going to do worse. But the extent to which or whether you can use other cues to help you out, we just don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
You spoke earlier about how bone conduction aid takes the signal to both sides of the hearing apparatus, and I'm wondering about hearing aids that bring the signal from the impaired ear to the good ear.
Like across?
Across, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I imagine that hasn't been looked at, but I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I'm like looking at either Dr. C or Dr. Liu. One study has looked at that. You know, we certainly haven't looked at that in our lab. One study's looked at that. You know, it introduces a lot of, you know, some of the questions with regards to intervention that we're interested in really get at the idea. So by doing any of these devices, whether it's an implant, a hearing aid, a cross hearing aid, a bone anchored hearing aid, one of the things you're doing is essentially changing either the types or the degree, or you're changing the cues. And a major question is, can children learn to use that information? You know, certainly with cochlear implants, they take this drastically different signal and they learn to talk. I mean, that's unbelievable. And so one of the things we try to do is break it down into, okay, so if you have a cross hearing aid, what have you done now to the cues that you might use to localize sound? And can you learn that new map? Can you learn that new set of cues? And then maybe, do you need to do it early? Like if we wait till a child's 6 or 7, have we wasted time that we should have intervened? And yeah, all great questions. And I think, I keep saying I don't know, but I don't think it's just me that doesn't know. I think well, it could be, but but I think it's just such a, we need data. I mean, we really need research data, and we need basic research data, we need applied, and it's coming. There really is, people are getting really excited about some of these topics, which for somebody like Dr. Liu must be wonderful, because she deals with these patients all the time, both clinically and in a research environment. Yeah. I'm not sure if it was very satisfactory, but yeah.
One more question. There's one up front here.
In regards to auditory habilitation, do you have resources that I can use for the two-talker speech in the therapy room that you can point me towards?
Yeah, you mean, we have, no, but yes, is the answer. There's nothing, we have one of the folks that I work with is a woman, Lauren Calandricio, and we've been working a lot on implementing a test of speech perception in a two-talker masker that would include options for testing both in English and Spanish. And that we usually will share with researchers, and some of those tools are available, but there's I'm not aware of any clinical specific training tool, but as a general rule, you know, we'll share materials and yeah, I don't have any data about whether it'll work or not, I guess is the issue. Yeah.
Well, and I'm assuming I could probably just go into the classroom and practice it there as well, more functional environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be, we don't tend to do training studies. We've talked about, like, for kids who come in my lab, which tend to be pretty acute lab sessions, they come in for 1 or 2 visits. You know, the only thing that we've come close to doing, I don't do auditory training, but there are some people who do really nice studies of auditory training. The only thing we've thought about doing is maybe providing the parents with materials before they come in. So if they listen to it every night for a dinner, joking, they're not fun. They're hard. Think of driving in a car with children and your husband asks you a question. Like, my solution is to give up. Like, I'm like, I can't, you know, it's that. That's, although I'd argue that is harder, because when they don't get your attention, they escalate, right? So they do that. But those are what we're really getting at. But whether, if you just listen to that passively, would you actually come in and learn properties, you know, learn the sort of properties of the patterns of speech, and, you know, maybe. But there are people who do sort of active training sessions, and to my knowledge haven't incorporated these maskers, but we always, when we see them, tell them we'd like them to try that. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.